Hello, I'm glad that you came for our book launch of the book Slavs and Tatars. Let me introduce Payam Sharifi, who is a member of the collective, and Pablo Larios, who is an editor of the Freeze magazine and also was an editor of the book itself. And we would like to focus a little bit our discussion around the issue of retrospective, because the book comes as an accompanying, it accompanies a series of exhibitions that Slavs and Tatars did. First of them was presented here at the Ujazdowski castle a year ago, more or less, almost, called Mouth to Mouth. Then it traveled to Tehran, where it was called Nose to Nose. Then got back to Istanbul, to Salt, and like several weeks ago, it opened in the Center for Contemporary Art in Vilnius. The series of exhibition was somehow triggered by the 10th anniversary of work and practice by Slavs and Tatars, and it somehow tried to deal with the idea of how to summarize the decade of work. However, none of the exhibition was a full retrospective. Only the book gives the full image of the group's practice. So we may say that only the book is a full retrospective of the group, which is meaningful as the group started as a reading club, actually, and for many years specialized in publishing more than exhibiting. So I would but there's a somehow there's a difference between the way you did the books before and the way this one is done. So maybe I would like to ask Payam for bringing us some ideas about how you used to work with the book and how this project is different from your previous work, just to start.
Thank you, Jarek, and everybody for making it again out at the end of a weekend, an exhausting weekend, but a good weekend. As you mentioned, for us this book was very different. We started as a publishing practice, and these behind me are the books that what I would call the sort of Slavs and Tatars books. Beforehand, each of our books addresses a particular subject matter, and they, in fact, the hierarchy, the traditional hierarchy, which usually sees the book as an afterthought, as a documentation, as a kind of a catalog of what has been shown in a museum or in a gallery, was reversed, because in fact our books previously would act as almost like a kind of user's guide to future works sometimes. So the opposite of a retrospectivization, in fact, a kind of what would be what's the opposite of retro?
Fortune telling.
Fortune telling. Yeah, a kind of I guess a prescriptive practice of some sorts. And the reason we decided to do this book was because it's important to break kind of the mold, and we felt that we had reached a certain point of, if there's one thing that I think we're quite confident about, is the ability to kind of put material, sort of research material, in a very tentacular constellation in our books, but none of our books actually describe the work. There's an example of that is, this is a kind of spread from not Moscow, not Mecca, and you can't tell really the difference between what's a research image and what's our work. Usually an artist's book has their own work against a white background, very clear, and then the research is black and white. And here, you can't really sort of distinguish between one or the other. So if our books until now had always been kind of, they really are the end point, So the sculptures, the installations, the exhibitions are in some ways an excuse to bring people back to these books. And what you mentioned about the retrospectivization, I didn't think about before, but actually it's the same, because the kind of authority of the book is still primary over the authority of the exhibition in a way that it's more complete. And an example I can give is, one of the important things about this book is that it also, one of Pablo's ideas was to actually kind of really divide it into the cycles. And we've been organizing our work as cycles of research, and there's essentially 7 or 8 cycles. And the most recent one is called Pickle Politics, about fermentation. And I think it's a good analogy for how the books worked in the past, because, again, like I use the kind of analogy of yogurt. To make yogurt, you need yogurt, and you have to take some bacteria from yogurt to make more yogurt. And for example, here, in our first book, Kidnapping Mountains, which is this one on the bottom left, Mola Nasruddin shows up as 2 pages, and then it becomes a whole book, 200 pages, subsequently becomes a work, and then the second edition of the book. So it's sort of, you can't escape for us, I guess, the printed practice. And I think that the idea of this book was, the new kind of monograph was to really draw a line in the sand and say, okay, this has been a decade of work. Now we have to radically rethink how we approach not only our practice, but most importantly, how do we approach the book within our practice? Because when you give, for the first 2 or 3 years, people had to read what we did. There was nothing else to do except read or look at a piece of paper. And the last 6 or 7 years, there's been this proliferation of media, and the sad truth is that if you give people a chance not to read, they will not read. So now, how do you reactivate this book within this kind of constellation of work? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, hopefully in the next several years we'll manage to do that. But it's not enough simply to make an interesting book anymore, research-wise, design-wise, compositionally.
Started to say a little bit, but I'm curious why you decided to make a kind of retrospective. You mentioned to me once that you deliberately didn't want to make regular catalogs. And then the time came that you decided to make a kind of catalogue raisonné of all your works. I was curious, what need you felt to undertake such a project? Why finally you decide to somehow look backward to your practice and to summarize it in the form of this kind of publication?
I mean, well, what happened was the world happened. The past 3 or 4 or 5 years of the world has made us, I think all of us, really reconsider how we're doing what we're doing. And I think that, if not to overstate the importance of art in any way, but it's simply not enough. No matter how important we think what we're doing is, it can't be good enough, because things are just getting worse and worse and worse around us. So Slavs and Tatars was founded at a very specific moment, in 2006, which was 2 years after the 10 new member states had joined the European Union, of course, including Poland and others. There was this kind of inexorable march westwards. Let's bring in all the shopping malls and Auchan and Carrefour and Tesco, and let's try to emulate a kind of Western modernity. And now that's obviously changed. The Middle East has changed considerably. The idea of political Islam has changed considerably in a decade. So we felt it was just necessary to mark a period and try somehow to force ourselves to move. It's almost like a challenge to ourselves. Is the weight of the book, in a very stupid way also, is none of these books are catalogs, as you mentioned. None of these books are hardcover, actually. And this is a kind of a small detail, but I had always wanted a hardcover book, and Kasia always made fun of me because she said that's very immigrant of you to want a hardcover book, because very, very kind of nouveau riche, you want this heavy book. And it's true that when, in a lot of societies, a book that's not hardcover is a magazine. Many places in the world, in Iran and in Azerbaijan, if you present a book that's not a hardcover, it's considered to be a magazine. People treat Mola Nasruddin as a magazine or Friendship of Nations. And the weight of the book in a very first degree manner is to force yourself to say, okay, when you put a book out like this, you have to change afterwards. You can't continue doing the same work because then it becomes a pure exercise in style. And that's not interesting. I mean, then it's a really internal dialogue and it's not an external dialogue, really.
Okay, so let's come to the book finally. I would like to ask Pablo to present us the main concept and the method how you work with the material, because it was you in your introduction starts, as far as I remember, from this claim that Slavs and Tatars are storytellers, right? How to put the storytelling and joke telling, because many of the works by Slavs and Tatars are also kind of have this witty aspect. How to form it into this kind of, what was the method you assumed with working with just resistant, I guess, material?
When I first spoke with Payam and Kasha about this notion of a monographic book that would sum up their practice, we spoke about this, and one of the first things that was mentioned was this notion that, what if I were positioned as editor, as someone who was kind of almost excavating the history of this collective that existed that maybe no longer exists. So internally we would joke that, I would be looking at the practice of an art collective that's already dead. So that became our internal shorthand for how to sort of position the editorial role of mine in relationship to artistic practice that already consists of considerable editing, considerable translation, considerable research. And so this was already quite exciting because, of course, what Slavs and Tatars sort of art practice comprises, partly exhibition making, partly lecture performances, and then also, of course, all forms of print media. So it became interesting, to actually kind of recursively, do that once over, and look back at their books and their lecture performances and their exhibitions, and approach them with a certain kind of degree of distance. I came to Slavs and Tatars work initially through publications, and I think of their work in relationship to certain kinds of information explosions that happened, of course, with digitization and with the access to information that we had with even, say, Google Books or Google Scholar, and there was always a kind of dialectical motion of, on the one hand, presenting an arcane joke or a certain history that would be unfamiliar to many people, and on the other hand, in presenting this as research and with considerable authority, but on the other hand, presenting it in a somewhat humoristic or visually appealing or visually jarring way, and also destabilizing that authority. And some of I think the richness of their practice lies in not really knowing sometimes what's real and what's not real, but also being led into something via routes of, say, confusion or not understanding or joke, stupidity, and this kind of rich. Payam and I realized that we shared a certain interest in the kind of rich history of stupidity that exists. So one of their cycles, titled "Made in Germany," looks at kind of Germany and also its relationship to, say, the politicization of Islam. And there are many figures that proliferate within Slavs and Tatars practice. And one of these figures, for instance, was a German counter-Enlightenment philosopher named Johann Georg Hamann, who was the best friend of Immanuel Kant, but very, very critical of Enlightenment claims of reason and a kind of progressivism of knowledge. And he would write very, very strange, deliberately confusing and deliberately obscure texts. One of them, for instance, is told from the perspective of the letter H, because at the time in Germany there were language reforms that were getting rid of the letter H because it was realized that it wasn't actually needed in the orthography of German, and so he said, I'm going to defend the letter H and write a polemical essay told from the perspective of this letter. And these kinds of stories reminded me of a lot of what Slavs and Tatars do. This performative way of publishing and of doing research. And on the one hand, again, kind of asserting authority, and on the other hand, questioning that. And I think this is something that we tried to preserve in the book, is this kind of careful navigation between presenting research information, presenting kind of very rich trivia and very rich histories, and also allowing for room for confusion and not knowing what things are, which I think is really important, also as an intellectual sort of stance.
I think one of the challenges was for the designers in a very basic function, and sometimes we flirt with this idea of traditionalism or being kind of more in the rear guard as opposed to avant-garde, and I think that one of these ideas, it's very dangerous to do so, of course, today, because we're living in times where we really are making some steps backwards, but one of the great works of the designers was just simply organizing information in a very clear way. And for us, the kind of the simple task of the book, which of course is never so simple, was to explain Slavs and Tatars, or what we do and how we do it. And one of the most difficult things to do, of course, is how do you represent a book in a book? It's always really horrible to see books in a book, because they're always small thumbnails and you can't read anything, and it's a quite sad experience. And I think one thing they did quite well is they actually they reprinted the covers of the books actually full scale in the book, and allowed a format so that when you're flipping through the book, it becomes a bit jarring to all of a sudden if you feel like somebody's actually slit a book inside of a book. So there's quite a strong approach to. It was kind of this dynamic, as Pablo mentioned, of always trying to clarify, but not explain, and that's a very delicate sort of line between those two, is how to make something available, but not necessarily sort of accessible in a way, and that's. I guess we have to see whether that worked or not, but.
I think it's interesting that Payam mentioned, that we're living in a kind of different world in many ways from that in which Slavs and Tatars began, because these techniques of humor and of a kind of literary authority that seems unstable, all of a sudden very quickly we're surrounded by all sorts of junk news and politicians and even reputable newspapers. Printing all sorts of material, and it's almost like that kind of the fictional universe of Slavs and Tatars took over the real one in a certain way, and suddenly it's like the media atmosphere in which we're living in is so confusing, and perhaps then it calls for the reciprocal motion of actually clarifying, which the book I think does, what. In a very delicate way, clarifying while not being, not hitting you over the head with any kind of, doctrine. Because I think one of the richest parts of Slavs and Tatars practice is this this generosity to alternative narratives, and presenting the dominant narrative while also presenting for uncertain ones or for apocryphal ones. that might also be the truth.
So, from my experience, the book gives us a certain key to your work, because finally you get access to knowledge. Access to knowledge which work is connected with which cycle of works or which series. So the book is divided into series, right? So the whole work you've done is organized very clearly into this 8 series of works. As far as I could understand, there are kind of longer description as you present now that sometimes I think a little bit change the narrative that appeared previously to the works. So I was interested how you reorganize retrospectively the work and how much you reinterpreted it while working on the book, actually.
Yes, I mean that's something that is always been a challenge, I think, for our gallerists, especially, but also curators. Is for example, we're very rarely shown in group exhibitions, and we have almost too many solo exhibitions per year, and it's a very strange phenomenon because we're told by both collectors sometimes, but also curators, that it's difficult to show one Slavs and Tatars work and not others. And this idea of this is an idea of sort of totum simul, which is that the whole is in the part. What we try to do with this book is show that how a work is linked, a sculpture is linked to a lecture, and how a lecture is linked to a publication, kind of drawing a kind of a flow chart almost. Not so didactic, but and when we sat with Pablo, and this was important to have Pablo and the designers really do the work of the editing, because it was important for us that this book doesn't look like our books. That's what Pablo said, we were almost like we're dead. We didn't want to be too present editorially or design-wise, but how do we discovered that these cycles of work, like Kidnapping Mountains is about the Caucasus, and this is about Iran and Poland, and then Central Asia and sort of Central Asian Islam, language politics, medieval advice literature. But there's one cycle of work which doesn't really exist as a cycle, which is there was works that go across all of our practice, 10 years, and that's the Kitab Kebabs, Mola Nasruddin, these kind of mascot, almost works. And so that we had to kind of create retrospectively a cycle that didn't really exist. It became the kind of zero cycle. So in the end, 7 cycles became 8. But it's very difficult when you have, for the Zamek show, for all the shows except in SALT in Istanbul, there was very extensive literature produced by the institution about the works. And what's difficult for institutions, as you know, is we produce so much writing that a lot of times institutions just take that writing and insert it. And that's a bit of a pity, because our view of the work is just one view. It's not an authoritative one at all. But it's almost, sometimes I wonder, I think it would be better if we didn't say anything. And in fact, Kasia often says I should stop talking, because it would be better for the work and the audience if you don't hear one narrative and just let people actually have their own approach to the works. This kind of instrumentalization is something I'm not afraid of, because I think that work should be instrumentalized, but the question is, to which moral direction is it instrumentalized, really? I don't think there's work, we don't believe in a kind of autonomous artwork in that sense, so.
And there are also some art critical texts also included to the book. And I was curious how you thought about mixing the presentation, the reinterpretation of your own work, and this kind of commentary which you decided to add to this. So maybe you could say how you thought about this criticism that should accompany this retrospective vision.
Yeah, when we were working on the book, we immediately knew that presenting a monograph with the kind of standard way in which exhibition views and images of works are accompanied by, let's say, 3 critical essays, that somehow that wouldn't be enough. Partly because of the fact that books are kind of a key core to Slavs and Tatars practice. So there was that issue: how do we represent the books? But then there's the kind of remarkable amount of writing and storytelling and research that Slavs and Tatars have done, and we presented that sort of as it is, and it was our goal that this book would be also a kind of research document. Maybe I'm somewhat of a nerd, but I like sort of getting lost in encyclopedias and old dictionaries and finding some strange word, and some of that slightly nerdy joy of discovery, I think, should be transmuted into the book. But of course, it became important to also contextualize Slavs and Tatars practice, let's say, externally. And there were several ways of doing this, because Slavs and Tatars practice is always, it's always straddling different geographical regions or different sort of creative processes. For instance, crafts and art, or applied art and design, and an autonomous art, which Payam says that they don't believe in. And also geographical sort of strata that are always being sort of smudged together. And we use the function of the critical essays, and there's 3 in the monograph, are to, let's say, kind of slice through these different strata of the practice. So in one of the texts, we had an American art critic and art theorist named David Ujazdowski present Slavs and Tatars' work in relationship to the logic of aggregation. So as I mentioned earlier, for me, and I think maybe for some other people, Slavs and Tatars' negotiation of information came out of kind of general renegotiation of information that happened in the wake of our kind of new age of information or whatever, and so the logic of aggregation, so the aggregate, the thing that's been added to the other thing and evolved and become something else, which is, I think, a very concise way of summing up some of the, let's say, lexical and almost hermeneutic processes that one enters when engaging with this work. So Ujazdowski, evaluates Slavs and Tatars in relationship to this notion, which is very technological. There are news aggregators, there are search aggregators, and I think it's very interesting that what immediately could seem like somehow a very lo-fi practice is brought in, which I don't think it is. I think there's sort of very advanced technologies working, information technologies, let's say, working within the practice. But what seems like a very crafty and almost retrograde aesthetic, to link that in relationship to a specific, very advanced technology that we don't really understand, which is like the autonomous technology of aggregation. I thought that was very interesting. And then we have Susan Babé, who's an expert in Islamic art at the Courtauld, and she had a very, very different relationship to Slavs and Tatars' work, because coming out of the parallel but in many ways divergent art history of Iran, for instance, offered a very distinct relationship to a very distinct view onto these specific renegotiations that Slavs and Tatars make. And so her text evaluates Slavs and Tatars in relationship to sort of devotional literature and devotional architecture. So devotion and faith, these are all concepts that resurface in Slavs and Tatars' work, and I think they're very clever in locating. We all believe in the art world that we're all somehow very sort of politically and socially progressive, but Slavs and Tatars can be, let's say, quite provocative in locating certain pressure points, and when you locate when you say religion or God in an contemporary art context, half the room will flinch. And locating that, which is, sorry, it's ridiculous because the history of art is intertwined with histories of religion and politics and all sorts of other things. To separate these things is absurd, but many people do. So to evaluate Slavs and Tatars' work in relationship to specific, religious histories and religious art, I think was very crucial. And then the other sort of straddling that occurred in that essay was the fact of research. So the fact that an academic, training, or an academic publishing in scholarly journals told an account of actually using Slavs and Tatars' work as research, which I think is great. I mean, what sort of better use for research than for more research? I mean, that's great. More yogurt, yeah. And then the third was an essay by Jörg Heiser, who's the director of the Institute of Art and Context at the University of the Arts in Berlin. And he places the more recent cycle, so pickle politics, and which investigates fermentation and yogurt and pickling as almost sort of metonyms for kind of nascent nationalisms and recalcitrant political movements. And so he wrote a kind of very urgent text, placing Slavs and Tatars' practice in relationship to sort of contemporary politics, which I think is a very important part of the practice. So we have religion, we have politics, we have technology, and these are they all enter into a very complex relationship. But these are things that, as I said before, are often kind of missed, I think, in the general discourses of contemporary art. Political art has a very complex history and can also be instrumentalized. And I think the logic of instrumentalization, which Payam mentioned, who's doing the instrumentalizing and for what ends? These are important questions, and so these are the kind of goals with these specific 3 text commissions.
I find David Joselit's text the most astonishing in a way. And you mentioned that he somehow uses this concept of aggregator, but for aggregators, the examples he gives are mostly web pages, right? Like eFlux or Artsy or Contemporary Art Daily. So he notices that this is the way how, in a sense, our knowledge about art, but also art practices in a way, are somehow grouped and presented to us. So what do you think about about this book as a kind of counter-aggregator in a way? Because it is also an aggregator, right? We may say that books aggregates things. And for Joselit, it is also important to somehow juxtapose aggregation to accumulation, right? So he says that aggregation is kind of critical practice, contrary to a capitalism or whatever accumulation. So we can see in a way the book as an aggregator, but then what would be its relation to this kind of knowledge production or elaborating that is done through these internet aggregators, which are the starting point for Joselit's. How would you see this issue?
I mean, Joselit's text was a pre-existing essay, actually, published in October magazine, and 3 or 4 years ago, and we had no idea that this text was being written until it was published. And what he does is he very convincingly and synthetically kind of gives a history of contemporary art by identifying the document, the ready-made, and then the aggregate, I think. But there's one more. The archive, yes, the archive, the document, the ready-made, and then he says that today is the aggregate in some sort. And it was the first time we thought about the role of technology within our work, to be honest, because we never actually think about our work within. We never think about our work as art, meaning within a kind of a historicization of art. We think about the work, how it can exist as art, but not what does it mean as art, in a sense, because we're just focused on the actual subject matter and not the discourse of the subject matter and not the discourse of the form, let's say. And it was, I think there was a certain question of how relevant the work, even that essay, how much that essay had aged, which is why Pablo wanted him to do a postscript. So he wrote another kind of a page and a half to bring it up to date, because that was, things in technology are changing so quickly that even 3 years is almost a lifetime in that sense. But yes, I think you're right. This book is in some ways an anti-aggregate of that, or no, I don't know what you think about that, Pablo. It's undoing. It's a compilation of some sort. I don't know how the collision of those different registers of knowledge, I think maybe still is somewhat relevant, because it's, again, there's no hierarchization really of the works, the lectures and the books. They're kind of on a similar level, and that was something that was very important for us, is how do you maintain, it's always very difficult to maintain the book on a kind of high art level when you have a strong visual statement. The visual statement will always eclipse the book. And I think, as you can sort of see with the book, there's so many areas of text that are not essays that also become little tangents, sort of going a little bit further. So I hope it's, I mean, the idea is that it, like Pablo mentioned, is to have a reference book of some sorts.
Something, if you look at the numerous publications that Slavs and Tatars have made previously, something that always struck me is its relationship to a different art form which is actually performance. And I always, this sounds pejorative, but it's not. But I always thought of them as doing a kind of performative publication practice, in the sense that if you look at the early history of the English novel with something like Tristram Shandy, it's an extremely performative text where this is a kind of classic deconstructionist argument, but that what would seem to be the most kind of pure version of the literary novel is actually filled with digressions, interruptions, self-characterizations, doubt, where the kind of literary author is actually performing that role. So I use this, this notion of a performative publication in this very kind of long and also very digressive, history that exists there. But the strange thing about it is you can never find a kind of way in. You can never find you can never say, aha, this is the point of this, or which is as accessible as these texts are. There's a kind of surface to them that you can never really get behind, which stands into a very different relationship to, I would say, almost like truth, to something like this book, which is, there are many ways in. You'll never actually read it cover to cover, probably. So, but if you can read a page of it, you may have understood, the rest of it in a certain way. So this idea of the part and the whole, that we keep coming back to, the yogurt idea, or the pickle that pickles something else. We wanted this to be sustained in the book. In terms of this notion of aggregation, I think when the David Joslet text was written, there was a kind of collective fascination and also fear within contemporary art that the documentation would supersede the actual work. So, for instance, which is a very long, this is like also Walter Benjamin in certain respects, but you suddenly had Efflux and Contemporary Art Daily and these aggregation technologies / websites that would allow people all over to experience a huge amount of contemporary art very quickly, or to think they experience it. And it's interesting that Joslet places Slavs and Tatars practice in relationship to this logic, because this is precisely what they're always doing. You know, you see the exhibition and you realize that, oh, the real exhibition is the book, or you read the book and you say, oh, actually this book is based on a performance, and you never really get to the bottom of that, which is, I think, maybe relates to what he's trying to claim in placing you guys as aggregators, and for which I think maybe it's an interesting idea to consider this book as a kind of anti-aggregation, or a compilation of sorts.
So maybe it's now time for the question from the audience or commentaries about aggregation, pickling, fermenting.
Do it informally at the coffee shop as well.
Yes.
I think we all need some coffee. I think.
So thank you very much
Thank you for coming.
coming.